Hey guys. Hey y'all. Hey. How do we start this? Hey y'all, I've been meaning to do a video for a while now, kind of sharing my immigration story. I've shared this a couple times before in writing, but I've never really done this via video, and I just feel like it would be a completely different experience to kind of have me tell the narrative directly versus like, thinking about it in writing. I'm pretty vocal about the fact that I am an immigrant. I am from the Philippines. I was born and raised in Cebu, which is the central part of the Philippines, an island in the central part of the Philippines. The region is called Visayas. And I grew up speaking Bisaya, but I actually also grew up speaking English. It's a little bit complicated. So I grew up in a time in the Philippines when there was a lot of praise for teaching kids English. And so I went to a quote-unquote international school growing up where our classes were taught in English. And even outside of the classroom, we literally were fined in some cases. Like there was a stupid rule where you had to pay like 5 pesos every time you said like a Bisaya word. Anyway, all of that to say that growing up, I primarily spoke English. I could understand Bisaya, pretty well, and I could speak it, although kind of like having a hard time whenever I would do it. And so I'd say English was really kind of like my primary language. Born and raised in Cebu, never lived anywhere else in my entire life there. I had been to Manila like a couple of times, but for the most part, I really didn't leave the island that I grew up on. When I grew up, I'm the youngest of 4 siblings. My family had a lot of financial struggles. And so, it was always about how are we gonna pay our bills? At one point, I think we even were at risk of losing our house. Growing up, the only income that I was aware of that was steady for my family was a little restaurant / store that my mom put up in front of our house. Basically, it's called a sari-sari store or a carinderia. That it was like a 2-in-1 in this case. A sari-sari store is kind of like a convenience store, if you will. And then a carinderia is an eatery. You kind of just point at what you want and then you eat. It's not like a full-blown restaurant. And so we had one of those in front of my house in the Philippines. It literally had the big Coca-Cola logo. If you're from the Philippines, you know what I'm talking about. And so growing up, that was really the only kind of what I perceived to be the main source of income for my family. It was never enough. It got to a point where we really had to start looking for other means to kind of make a living for ourselves. And so when I was around maybe 8-ish, my sister, who is 11 years older than me, had just graduated from college as a nurse. And this is at the time in the Philippines where there was massive hiring for Filipino nurses to go abroad and work in the United States. And so my sister was kind of going through the process of taking all the necessary exams that she needed to take in order to move to America and work here. And my sister was 20, 21 years old. And I think my brother, my eldest brother, who is 12 years older than me, he's the one that planted the seed in my mom's head to be hey, because she had graduated as a nurse 20 years prior. As my sister is kind of going through her rounds of studying for exams and looking for an agency that would set her up with a job in the United States, my mom decided to do the same thing, despite the fact that she had never worked as a nurse a single day in her life. Basically, she got her nursing degree and then she got married and she had kids, and that was her life. She never worked as a nurse. And so after 20 plus years of not studying the material as compared to like these fresh grads. Like my mom joined like these review classes with other aspiring and immigrant nurses. I'd say like the process was basically, I want to say like 5 years in total. It was very long, a lot of exams. I remember my mom would actually take me sometimes to like her review classes to study for the CGFNS, the NCLEX, all these exams. And like, like it would literally be like her that was like 20 plus years older than everyone else, who was like my sister's age. We already had a lot of relatives in the United States, in New Jersey in particular. And my mom's cousin had set her up with an agency that was going to get her a job in the Bronx in New York. And she had like done the paperwork there, and after a certain point, she stopped hearing from that agency, I believe. And so she figured that it was kind of just like, all right, like we gotta keep going and find the next agency. And so she started the same process with the agency that my sister was getting set up with. So she was set to go to Baltimore and work as a nurse there. My mom was going through the rounds, the same exact process of like paperwork, you have to like pay for agency fees. And then after a certain point, we heard back again from the agency that was gonna get her a job in the Bronx. And so I think she had already signed something at this point. So they were like, hey, you committed to us. And so at this point, she was committed to 2 agencies, one in the Bronx and then one in Baltimore, where my sister was set up. And to my understanding, the way that she ended up choosing between the 2 like agencies is whichever had the lower fee to like terminate your contract. Ultimately, my mom canceled her contract with the agency that would have got her a job at a hospital in Baltimore, and instead she pursued the agency that put her in a nursing home in the Bronx. My sister moved to Baltimore in March of 2006. It was really unclear as to like when I was gonna see her again, or like what that future was gonna look like. And so when she had moved to Baltimore, I was 12 years old and she was 24. I remember that day at the airport so vividly, because honestly, it was one of the most painful days of my life. I look back on that moment and I can feel the pangs of pain in my chest from just the sadness that I felt in terms of like what I perceived to be losing my sister at that point. She left, and I remember I went back to our house and I just like bawled in her room. A couple months later, we ended up moving to the United States, my mom, my brother, and I, in August of 2006. We moved to New Jersey. My mom got a job working in the Bronx, but we didn't have any family in the Bronx. And since my mom would be working, there wouldn't really be anyone to like watch me and my brother. At the time, I was 12 years old, and my brother, he has a learning disability. And so he ended up getting set up with a job at Burger King through like family members that were working there. So I talked to my mom about this recently, and I asked her actually, why did we stay in Jersey while you were living in the Bronx? And what she said was that she saw that my brother was starting to get situated in this town in Jersey with his job, and he had a network of friends. And so she decided that it was best for us to just stay in Jersey. So what happened was, the setup was that she was sharing an apartment with other immigrant nurses in the Bronx, and I lived with an aunt and other relatives in one house. Mind you, these are relatives that I really didn't grow up with, but everyone was super welcoming. And then my brother lived in another house with my uncle. And so I moved to this town in New Jersey called Belleville. It's about 30 minutes outside of New York City. And I had just graduated 6th grade in the Philippines. And so I went straight into middle school. As we all know, middle school is not the prettiest place to be. I feel like middle school in itself is already like a shitty experience. And so on top of that, like being a new immigrant to this country and like figuring out like this new identity, this new environment was definitely a challenge. Like middle school was a super transformative experience for me. I'd say at that point is when I really like latched onto my Filipino identity, because like I think that's when I kind of started to like, you know, you're going into puberty and you start to realize like, oh, I think I like, you know, might not be like these other kids. Like I was always teased for being gay growing up, and that's a completely different story. We'll get to that another time. But like all that to say that like I was like confused, and like at this point, the only thing that I could really latch onto was my Filipino identity. Middle school was really rough. I'd say like the first year and the first couple of months, like in 7th grade, like that was super challenging. I'd say by 8th grade, I started to get a little bit more acclimated. I made like some good friends. You know, even though I only lived in that town for 2 years in Belleville, that was a time when I really tried to assimilate. Like, cause you know, people would like make fun of me for like being an immigrant, or like, you know, when you don't know certain things about culture, like people call you out for it. Like, oh, you don't know who this artist is? You don't know who like this person is? At that age, like to make up for that, I would literally study American culture, like starting with like my accent. Like people are often surprised that like I grew up in the Philippines because they don't hear an accent, blah 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 blah. Well, it's because I literally was like shamed into erasing it. You know, people would make fun of me for the way that I talked. So what I did was I would go home and I would mimic how people talked on TV. To try and like get an American accent. I lived in that town for 2 years, and then I only saw my mom on the weekends, which was super rough because, as I mentioned earlier, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and you know, she was always around to like pick me up from school and like, you know, cook for me, etc. But I had to like figure this out on my own. My dad eventually followed us. Like we moved in August and my dad eventually followed a couple months after. But growing up, he was never really that present as a parent. And so even though we were in the same household again at this point, like I kind of was like left to fend for myself a lot. I remember like I gained a lot of weight when I first moved to America, because at one point, like all I would eat was like frozen dinners that I would microwave, and either that or like the Burger King meals that my brother would take home. And like I was on like reduced lunch at school lunches. I don't know what they're like at this point, but like they were not healthy. Like I remember like I would eat a cookie every day. I don't know what else I ate, but it was definitely not healthy. So I gained a lot of weight then. I definitely have pictures where I'm like chubby, and yeah, like chubby immigrant kid from the Philippines, like not a setup for being popular. I've lived in the US for, it'll be 14 years now, which is a really long time. I remember like the days when like, oh, this is our 5-year anniversary of living in the US, and like that's when we ended up becoming US citizens. And then like now like, oh, it's our 10-year anniversary, and then now it's like 14 years. Like it's crazy. I remember at one point I was like reflecting on how like, wow, this is like last year was the year when I can say that I can no longer say that I lived majority of my life in the Philippines, because I lived in the Philippines from when I was 0 to 12, and then now I'm 26, so 12 to 26, like I've lived here longer than I lived in the Philippines. But all that to say that like I still hold my Filipino identity very close to me. I think some of the things that have helped contribute to that are like, one, definitely starting with like my parents. Like they're still very much like Filipino mindset. Like they go to the Philippines every year. You know, that's kind of just their mindset. Like they're just they came here to work, and then eventually they're gonna move back to the Philippines. And so like I think having that household where like it was never like, oh, this is our new home. It was kind of like, this is just like what is temporary for us to like survive at this point. And then the other part, probably the fact that like, you know, my brother still lives in the Philippines, and like a lot of relatives still do, and like I still keep in touch with like my friends in the Philippines, my childhood friends. I'd say the other thing that's also kind of contributed to the like my connection to the Philippines is that when I was in college, I did a fellowship where I lived in Manila, and it was called the Kaya Co Fellowship, where it was part internship and part like immersion program. Coming back to the Philippines when I was 20, 21, like as an adult, like I'd say like really helped to solidify my relationship with like my heritage, because I learned so much more about like the Philippines as an adult versus like just what I knew from when I was growing up there. And then I'd say the last thing was working for the Filipino channel. I worked for TFC, abs-cbn for 2.5 years. And so, you know, I really like fostered a strong connection with the Filipino American community, because that was like the news and topics that we covered, but also like just building a relationship with like, or maintaining a connection and a relationship with the Philippines in general. Being an immigrant is not easy, but I'm really appreciative of the life experience that it's given me. I feel like, it's gonna sound weird, but like I have like this dual worldview where like I had one completely different cultural perspective, and then got like literally like picked up and like had to kind of rework my mind. And I know there's a lot of like research and studies that are done about like, you know, the immigrant experience. And you know, like if you think about it, like there are people who lament so much on like their summer abroad in Europe, and that's Europe. Like, you know, it's like it's relatively close in proximity culturally to the United States. Like that's like, it's still Western. Whereas like coming from the Philippines and then like moving to the United States, it was a really big adjustment. And so it's something that I hold very near and dear to my heart, and something that I'd say I still think about often. But yeah, I mean, I'm a proud immigrant. You know, there's a lot of discourse about like immigrants in this country. This country was literally founded on immigration. We are on stolen land, and just because, you know, like one person is like in the majority now, like they're gonna close the borders because the people coming in don't look like them. That's not how it works. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you click the like button if you enjoyed this. Leave a comment down below. Let me know, you know, if you're an immigrant, where are you from, or what your experience was like. And if you like seeing these videos about my Filipino background and like my life experiences, let me know what type of video you'd want to see next, and hit that subscribe button for more videos, and I'll see you next time. Bye.